Good afternoon. My name is Joseph Castro, and I'm an affiliated faculty at the UC Berkeley Center for Studies in Higher Education. I'm pinch hitting today as moderator for George Blumenthal, who unfortunately does not have access to electricity due to this weather that we're facing. Today's webinar is titled, "Who Should Pay for College?" This is a topic on the minds of millions of students, families, educators, policymakers, and others. It is especially timely due to an announcement today by the Biden administration that aims to reduce loan indebtedness for some college graduates. I want to invite you to share your questions or feedback in the live chat, and I'll share as many of them as possible with our panelists after the presentation. Well, who should be responsible for the cost of college? Students, their parents, the government? Should tuition at public universities be free? Should student loans be forgiven? Is college worth the cost? These are among the questions that Natasha Quadlin, Brian Powell, and their research team asked thousands of Americans for more than a decade. This webinar discusses how Americans responded to these questions and how their views on higher education have changed in a short period of time. With the high cost of college, the loans students are taking, and the current controversies related to loan forgiveness, this discussion will surely be informative and provocative. Now to the introductions of our speakers. Natasha Quadlin is an Associate Professor of Sociology at UCLA. Her research examines social inequality in the contemporary United States with an emphasis on inequality in access and returns to education. She is particularly interested in using large-scale experiments and surveys to examine the mechanisms behind inequalities in schools, families, and labor markets. Brian Powell is James H. Rudy Professor and co-director of the Preparing Future Faculty Program in the Department of Sociology at Indiana University. He also is affiliated faculty of the Department of Gender Studies and the Kinsey Institute. He served as department chair and was a visiting scholar at the Russell Sage Foundation. I'd now like to turn it over to Natasha to start off. Thank you, Natasha.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us here today. I'm getting over a cold, so I might have to cough a little bit, but we'll just make it work. Okay, so this is our book published by the Russell Sage Foundation last year in 2022, titled Who Should Pay? Higher Education, Responsibility, and the Public. And so in this book, we're reporting results from research that we conducted over a period of about 10 years in which we asked Americans who should be responsible for the funding of college. So I'll get to the specifics of the questions that we asked in a second, but I first want to underscore that this is the public that we're talking about. So this book is not about who we think should pay for college. It's not about like a broad philosophical question of who should pay for college or anything that we personally believe. I just wanted to note that because some of the questions for the webinar were along the lines of, why do you think this? But this is not really a book about us per se. At the same time, it's also important to note that the nature of public opinion research is different than other analyses that we might do as higher education researchers, because there are necessarily limits to what the public knows about higher education and what they really care about. So this method is great for collecting data on broad topics like responsibility for higher education and for costs, and who should be responsible, but it's not great for collecting data on very specific topics like the FAFSA or Pell Grants or the very specific details of plans that like Biden proposes, for example. So these are things that we might discuss and debate at very high levels among scholars and practitioners. But if you ask the average person, what do you think about how the FAFSA works? Most people just aren't going to know what you're talking about. So we think it's vitally important to talk with the public about these issues because public opinion is often a leading indicator of public policy. And because we're having so many public discussions these days about topics related to higher education, loan forgiveness, et cetera, and it's really important to see where the public stands and then also how this has changed over time. Okay, so I'm going to kind of give a rundown of the main argument of the book, and then Brian is going to go into some more details about the findings, and then some of the other questions that we asked our interviewees that get into some really interesting topics. But this question that I have on the slide is really the main crux of the book. So we conducted telephone interviews with nationally representative samples of respondents in 2010 and then also 2015. And then we took these online in 2019 and 2020. So we have a full 10 years of data. And the core question we're asking respondents is, who should have the main responsibility for the cost of education beyond high school? Should it be students, parents, the state or local government, or the federal government? And so these are the stakeholders that historically have played the largest roles in the funding of college. Their influence, of course, has ebbed and flowed over time, but these are generally the main stakeholders that we think of. And we wanted to know how Americans are specifically attributing this responsibility for the funding of college. This question actually, like the actual phrasing and this exact question, was first fielded in the high school and beyond survey. So many of you may be familiar with this, or you may have used it in your research. But this was a question that was first fielded in 1980 in one of the NCES Department of Education studies. And to our knowledge, it was never fielded again on a national sample until we fielded it in 2010. So I'll touch on that in a second because it's relevant to kind of what we find. But so a couple of things to note about this question. So when we say cost of education beyond high school, this is up to the respondents to define it however it makes sense to them. So based on the interviews we conducted and the narratives that people often gave, the vast majority of respondents were thinking about four-year or bachelor's level education. There were certainly some respondents who thought about community colleges and trade schools and other types of institutions in addition to the bachelor's level, but this question really conjures up four-year institutions for the vast majority of people. So when we talk about college or the cost of college, we're typically talking about four-year institutions because this is what our respondents were thinking of. And more specifically, actually, we're really talking about about four-year public institutions, not just four-year institutions generally, because these are the institutions that could conceivably be funded in large part by the government. Also, this is one of the questions that came up before the webinar. One more point. When we say cost of education, this, of course, can be extremely complicated. So the way that respondents typically understood it and the way that we discussed it in the book is that we're talking about the amount that students currently pay in tuition and fees. So we're not going to ask the public about appropriations or other complexities in higher education finance, but instead, this is the amount that's being billed to students right now. Who should be responsible for it? Should it be the way that it is right now, or should it be changed to some extent? Okay. So as a follow-up to this main question, we also asked a second question, which was who should be the second most responsible for the cost of education beyond high school? And the response categories were, of course, the same, but they had to choose a different stakeholder than what they chose in the first question. So if in the first question, they said students should have the main responsibility, they could have then said parents or state or local government or the federal government should have the second most responsibility. And this was not something that was asked in high school and beyond. So this is something that we added that is a supplement. But it's really important, we think, because no stakeholder really pays for higher education alone. It's really a combination of all of these plus other stakeholders that we haven't listed. And we kind of think of these between, so the choices that people choose for their main and second place stakeholder, those together, we kind of think of these as partnerships or compacts in the funding of higher education. So we wanted to know who respondents really wanted to partner together in the funding of higher education. And so we can do this by looking at their first and second choice stakeholders, which I'll show in a couple of slides. Okay, so let's get to it. So we'll start with the first score question in the first survey that we conducted in 2010. Who should have the main responsibility for the cost of education beyond high school? And so this is what we found. So 48% at that time said parents, about half the sample. 34% said students. And then 18% said government. So within that 18% government category, we have more people who are saying the federal government. That's 11% of the total sample. And then the state or local government is a smaller share. That's about 7% of the total sample. And so these numbers were really striking to us because they were nearly identical to what had been reported in the high school and beyond study in 1980. So I said before, this was first fielded in 1980, and then 30 years later, we're the first ones to kind of field this again. So in other words, 30 years passes. Americans still overwhelmingly believe that parents or students should be responsible for the funding of college. And we have most people who are saying parents. And we refer to this, so when people say either parents or students should be responsible, we refer to this as kind of an individualist solution in the book because it relies on individual families and students to pay for the student to attend, as opposed to a collectivist orientation, which is people who say government are more collectivist. So at this time, less than a fifth of Americans thought government should be the main stakeholder. And this was reiterated further when we looked at the combinations of stakeholders that respondents listed in their top two spots. So here we're talking about people's responses for the who should have the main responsibility and then who should be the second most responsible. And we're combining them to see how people are falling when we look at their two responses. So about 2/3 of respondents listed parents and students in their top two spots. It could have been in either order. So they could have said either parents and students or students and parents. We combine them together. These people are fully individualists. So they want individuals to bear their own responsibility for the funding of college. The next most common response was parents and government at 16%. This is kind of a hybrid individual collectivist orientation. It's the same for students in government at 11%. And then only 9% of respondents listed government in their top two stakeholders in 2010. So these are people who say federal government should be most responsible, and then state or local government should be second most responsible in either order. So based on this set of findings, okay, and knowing that basically nothing had changed since the 1980 high school and beyond survey, at this point, we were really expecting to write a book about the stubbornness of the American public with regard to higher education finance and higher education policy. So we thought a lot has changed in the world, right? College is much more expensive than it was in 1980. People have all this debt that wasn't nearly as ubiquitous in 1980. But still, Americans think individuals should pay their own way through college. So, however, okay, we wanted to run the study one more time to make sure we got the story right about this stickiness of public opinion. So in 2015, we replicated the same study. It's not the same respondents. It's a separate sample of people, just to note that, although both samples are similar in their composition, so that really doesn't explain any differences that we found. But this is what we found in 2015, and I leave the 2010 numbers up too, just for comparison. So by 2015, we're already seeing really big changes. This is for that first question, who should be the most responsible for the funding of college? The proportion who said parents, it goes down a little bit from 48 to 44. There's still the plurality. It's still the most common response, but it is going down. The proportion who said students, it goes down even more. So it goes from 34% to 26%. Now they're the smallest group in the sample. And then the only group to grow over this time is the government group. They go from 18% in 2010 to 31% in 2015. So in just this 5-year period, we're seeing double-digit growth in the percentage of people who think government should be the main stakeholder in the funding of college. In the world of public opinion, changes of this magnitude in this sort of time frame are extremely rare. Okay, so although we had planned to write a book about the stickiness of public opinion, how it doesn't change, how all of these changes that happened in higher education, but nothing had changed in terms of public opinion. This was our first clue that something massive had really shifted in the American public. And this was something that we wanted to dive into further to see what was going on here. The combinations, as you can imagine, also changed a great deal from 2010 to 2015. So these are the combinations of the main stakeholder and then the second place stakeholder. So parents and students, there are individualists. They're now about half the sample. This is still really common, right? So half of Americans are saying parents and students should pay for college, but it's 15% less than what it was in 2010. So it's a great deal smaller. And then the most growth, of course, is in this government category. So this is people who say the federal government and the state or local government should be the top two stakeholders. By 2015, they're fully a fifth of the sample. So this is a lot of growth. The last thing I'm going to show, and then I'll turn it over to Brian, is this figure. So I mentioned earlier that we conducted online surveys to supplement the telephone surveys that we did in 2010 and 2015. So again, in 2019 and 2020, for these studies, we're using nationally representative samples again. So the composition of the sample is approximately the same. We fielded them first in 2019. I think it was the fall when we were starting to write the book and kind of like it was rounding form. And then we did another survey in 2020 because, of course, the pandemic happened and we wanted to see if everything we thought we knew about public opinion had suddenly changed because of this enormous, public event and social upheaval that occurred. But what we found is that the patterns haven't changed further since 2015. And if anything, they're becoming more government focused. So we were in 2020, we were especially interested in, has this government orientation or this collectivist orientation completely gone away because of the pandemic? And we can confidently say that that's not the case. So over this whole time period, the parents and students category continues to shrink. The parents and government category grows. I suspect Brian is going to touch on this category more in a second, this parents and governments category. And now the government group is now a quarter of the US population. Again, a big amount of change in a short period of time, and therefore the message of our book is one about big changes in public opinion rather than about stagnation in public opinion, and also the capacity of the public to really change things surrounding higher education. So Brian, please take us away.
Okay. So Natasha talked about the changes that we've seen over time. I'd like to talk about a few things. The first thing I'd like to talk about is who are the people who are supportive of governmental funding? Who are the people who are supportive of a more privatized notion of funding? And we looked at a wide range of sociodemographic variables. And three of them we found to be the most interesting. One of them is racial differences. The racial differences are what we have here are the percentage of people who gave the different types of combinations in responses. And what you see among the white population is overwhelmingly parents, white respondents overwhelmingly, this is pooling the first 2 years of the data, although we had similar patterns after. The white respondents maintain much more of a privatized, private notion of funding, parents and students, students and parents. What's really interesting to me is the other three groups, Black, Asian, and Latina respondents. And what we see are I think some very, very interesting patterns. The first thing is that parents and students are represent a much smaller percent of the Black, Asian, and Latina responses than among the white respondents. Instead, if you look at the group that's increased considerably, one is government, and you can see 13%, 19%, 23%, 26%. But the one I found most interesting is the idea of parents in government. And what you see is among the Black respondents, about the same percentage of Black respondents said it should be parents in government versus parents and students. Asian respondents, in probably the most notable group, much more likely to say parents in government than parents and students. What's going on here? From our open-ended comments, from our interviews, one of the things we really got from the respondents is their notions of why should different groups of people pay or different organizations pay. For the white respondents, the numbers that we have are consistent with the idea that it is the students and the parents' job to pay for college. But if you look at the other groups, especially the Asian group, you see a very different pattern. In the pattern for the Asian group, for example, the modal category is parents and government. And the argument is not that government should be taking over on this, but the parents and governments, their job is to support students. And in turn, it's the student's job to be a student and to do well. So it's a very just different notion of responsibility. It's not saying that students don't have responsibility, but their responsibility is to focus on their studies. The next demographic group that we found very interesting are age differences. And I want to compare really the oldest group and the youngest group. And let's start with the oldest group, 65 and above. Here, this is simply who should have primary responsibility. Overwhelmingly, 62% of the respondents over 65 said it is the parents' responsibility. And in the comments that the older respondents sent to us, it's very clear that it's this notion that it is the parents' responsibility to support college. And it's not the government's responsibility. You see, it's a really tiny percentage. It's also a tiny percentage for students as well. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, maybe the older respondents are just having this very old-fashioned idea that, the tuition is really not that expensive, not unlike the idea I remember when I'm going to a movie theater cost only 5 cents. How can it be $7 today? And we actually tested that, and we asked different ages, different respondents, how much do they think it costs to go to college? And the perceptions of the older respondents were no different than the perceptions of the other groups. So it's not that the older respondents are saying parents should be responsible because they have some notion that it's cheap. Instead, they have this notion, it's basically a responsibility. This is supposed to be our legacy. Next slide. Now, if you look at combinations, you see the same basic combination. You see among older respondents, 2/3 of 65 and above still maintain this individual position. Oh, can you go back? Sorry. I forgot to talk about the 18 to 19-year-olds, and my students probably would be very upset about that. This is another pattern that surprised us. If you see 42% at the top, you would say, oh, young respondents believe that it should be the government's responsibility. That's not a surprise. But the other two numbers are a surprise. First thing is, when it comes to, is it the student's responsibility? They're no different than people 30 to 44 or 45 to 64, and they're even more likely than those 65 and above to say it is the student's responsibility. Interestingly, this age group, which often has been characterized as very selfish and very, supposed to be protected by their parents, they're the group least likely to say that parents are responsible. So what we see here are two different things going on among younger adults. On one hand, they believe government should be involved, and that's consistent with just what we know about younger versus older people's views about social policies. But among the younger adults, they also say it's their responsibility. And from the interviews, we saw and heard many respondents, many people who are young, saying, we are adults and therefore we are responsible. As opposed to older respondents maybe saying, students are not adults and it's parents who are responsible. Let's go 2 slides down. And so the third group that I want to mention is political identification. This is a pattern, these first 2 patterns were surprising to us. This pattern doesn't surprise us at all. Lo and behold, people who identify themselves as conservatives are the least likely to say the government should be involved. People who identify as liberal are the most likely to say that government should be involved. This pattern is pretty much expected. Now, there are other sociodemographic variables that we looked at. Next slide. And before I talk about any of these, I want to mention one that I didn't list, and that is region. And we found one curious, and then retrospect makes a lot of sense, interesting regional difference. And it's not that different people from different regions have different views about whether it's the government or parents or students who are responsible. No, the big difference was whether when they mentioned the government, did they say it should be the state government or did they say it should be the federal government? Which one did they mention more often? And if you remember, the overall pattern is that more people mention the federal government than the state government. There are regional differences, and the regional difference basically can be characterized as the northeastern part of the United States versus every place else. And what we found is in the Northeast, there's much more likely to mention the federal government as responsible, and the state government is less responsible. For the rest of the country, and in particular on the West Coast, more likely to say that the state government should be involved, or definitely much more likely than in the Northeast. Now, if you think about the higher education structure, if you think about the nature of public universities and private colleges throughout the country, there can be a very clear explanation for that. I'm from New York, and in New York and in many parts of the Northeast, there's like a private college pretty much 30 minutes from you. 30 minutes away, 30 minutes away, 30 minutes away. It's overwhelmingly a huge number of private schools. So the public university system in the Northeast is not as visible in the way that we see in other places. In California, for example, yes, you do have USC, you do have Stanford, but the pride and joy of the state in terms of higher education is the very extensive public university system that's there. The state of Indiana, you ask people about universities, they think of Purdue University and Indiana University, the public universities. So the regional pattern is very clear. If you're in a state in which there's a strong public university system, or at least a more visible one than a private system, then people are more likely to see the state as more involved. Okay, regarding these other differences. These other differences regarding gender, education, income, parenthood, and religion are more interesting in part by what they don't do. In terms of gender, there are different possibilities. It could be that women are going to be more supportive of the idea of parents being responsible. It could be that they just think of their children, just have more of a commitment to the idea of supporting their children. Alternatively, it could be that women are more aware of the challenges for education for many people and more likely than to say should be the federal government or the state government involved. What we find is the gender differences sort of wash out. There's almost no difference between men and women in responses. There are gender differences regarding other questions, but for who should be responsible, there isn't. In terms of education, you also can have different predictions. One possibility is, you think about it, people who don't go to college may think, why should we be responsible for college if we're not going to college? And it could be that people who have a college degree, who may have a more expansive vision of what college can be. And relatedly, the argument has been that at least in certain domains, college can be liberalizing. From that perspective, we might expect that people without a college degree are more likely to say its parents and students are responsible, and people with a college degree would be more likely to say the government's responsible. But there's another possibility, and it's the possibility that links to the concept what we refer to as opportunity hoarding. The people who have resources don't necessarily want to share those resources with others. And it could be that people who have had a college degree are more likely to say, we paid for it, we went through it through a privatized system, they should as well. We weren't sure which pattern would occur. Turns out that those two issues wash out. We find very little difference between it in terms of education, in terms of support for college, of who should be responsible. The income differences and parenthood differences and religion differences are similarly not as strong as you see for race, political identification, and age. Next slide. Okay. We asked several other questions, and I only have a few more minutes. I just want to briefly talk about some of these. In one of the chapters, we asked, why should they pay? And we wanted to have a notion of why are people saying the state government's responsible, or the federal government's responsible, or parents should be responsible, or students should be responsible. And if we had an hour or so, we'd be showing you lots of quotes and lots of explanations for why people, the different notions and types of accounts people have when they're talking about it. The only thing I do want to say regarding the open-ended comments is they give us a hint as to why things are changing so quickly. The first thing is we found that in 2010, almost no one was talking about debts. Almost no one was talking about, people were not talking about college in the way they were talking about how staggering debts were even 5 years later. And so we could just see that from the open-ended comments, why there was also like something indeed was happening. Another thing that happened in terms of, we noted in some of the open-ended comments, is that is this idea there's a spillover effect from other social policies. And what we found is that several people mentioned the ACA, or otherwise Obamacare. And they mentioned it in a way that we did not anticipate. They basically said, they compared education to healthcare. And they basically said that if healthcare is a right, if we can provide support for healthcare for people, then we can do the same thing in terms of education. And just the timing of Obamacare is just another factor in terms of some of the explanations people give. Another thing we asked in the book was, should college be free? Or more specifically, should tuition at public universities be free for qualified students? And there are a lot of, if people have questions, we could explain why we asked all of those, each of those parts. But we wanted to know people's notions about whether college should be free. I should note, we did not ask this at the beginning of the surveys. It was later on when we were continuing our data, we asked it. Because the idea of free college, although some universities have different types of free college systems, for community college, there are different programs in some other states, it still was not even part of the consciousness of America in 2010. So what we do find is that a large, overwhelming percentage of the population actually agreed with the statement that college tuition should be free for people, qualified students at public universities. It's an overwhelmingly large number. Now, that overwhelmingly large number, though, has to be viewed with a little bit of caution, because we then asked why they said this. And it turns out that a large number of people would say, yes, it should be free, but students should pay something. Or yes, it should be free, but it should be free for only people who make a certain amount of money. In other words, they were basically saying college should be free, but still, it was still a very different notion of a response than we would have seen years ago. One thing we did not ask in the book was whether or not loans should be forgiven. And there's a good reason. That was not even part of our discourse in 2010, 2015. In 2019, starting to happen. We started asking those questions this last summer, last spring, summer, fall. And what we find is that we basically gave them different types of, should all loans be forgiven for all people? Should all loans be given for people with a limited amount of money? Should some be provided to, and we had different combinations. What we find again is a large number of people are supportive of loans. And again, it's yes, but it turns out that there's pretty strong support for some type of loan forgiveness. We actually also asked for the people said that some loans should be forgiven. We gave them different amounts of money that should be forgiven in the 10,000 figure that the Biden had proposed, and was actually pretty much the sweet spot when it comes to people's responses. In other words, the Biden proposals have been very consistent where the average American is. We asked one other question, because when you think about loans and you think about free tuition, these are both important initiatives, but they're also both expensive initiatives. And many people from our question in our interview or in our surveys said that, forgiving loans is just a Band-Aid. It does not solve the problem of the future. Is it that we're always going to forgive loans? And so it made us think about, which do people think is more important? Is it the loan forgiveness, or is it about trying to reduce tuition or make tuition free? So we asked that question just a few months ago. And we basically said, you have two choices. Which one do you think is more important? And again, overwhelmingly, the idea of handling the tuition problem is much more supported than in handling the loan situation. That doesn't mean people are not supportive of forgiveness of loans, but in terms of thinking about how to have some type of policy for the future, they're thinking much more of trying to think of coming up with a tuition program, a program where tuition is free, would actually have a great deal of support among the public. I don't have much more time. I'm just going to mention two other questions we asked. We asked whether or not, we basically asked about people's perceptions of fairness and accessibility in college. Do people believe that most people are able to go to college, or do they believe that people are restricted? And then we asked about, do they believe that poor people have more opportunity, the same opportunity, or less opportunity than others to go to college? We asked the same thing about the middle class. We asked the same thing about racial groups. We also, and here are the questions that we had asked, so you can just see those questions. But we then also asked another set of questions about people's views about the value of college. We keep on hearing this discourse out there. College isn't worth it. College isn't worth it. There was, one politician, for example, who said, and actually several politicians who said something to the effect, we need more plumbers and fewer philosophers. And the whole idea is that people shouldn't necessarily be going to college. They should be doing other things. Ironically, the person who said that about plumbers and philosophers, has a child who, went to university. So it's maybe this idea that other people's children shouldn't go to college, but my children should. But the question we wanted to know is, do people think college is worth it? Do people see a real benefit from going to college? In almost any way we asked that question, the answer was yes. Okay, next slide. Is there a next slide?
Well, this is the last slide.
No, next slide is
last slide is just this.
There it is. We have to go back to
great.
the book. We believe that public opinion is really important, as Natasha said. public opinion is a way for us to get a sense of what, public opinion may reflect what's going on, but it also may drive what's going on. I think it's very telling, and that if we think about other social changes that have been occurring in the United States, and how it links to public opinion, there's a really clear link. Obviously, there are exceptions. The Dobbs decision, for example, regarding abortion would be a clear exception, and where policy and public opinion aren't necessarily corresponding. But you think about other ones. You think about the changes in people's views about the legalization of marijuana, and the views have become very liberalized. And in turn, policies have been changing. You think about what happened in terms of people's views about same-sex marriage and how it flipped around 2010. And only after that time did we really have supportive court decisions and legislative decisions that moved towards the legalization of same-sex marriage. We believe that the public opinion right now regarding higher education positions us to see some real changes in the funding of college. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sasha and Brian. It was really well done, and raises a lot of important questions in my mind, and I know the audience's mind. I want to invite folks to submit any questions they have through the chat, and I'll be sure to pass those on. Maybe I'll begin with a question about your finding of more interest in having the federal government be responsible, and tie that to the announcement today by the Biden administration focusing in on graduates of a certain income. It sounds like, as you said in your comments, this is maybe in the sweet spot, but I wanted you to speak to that, and maybe trends that you see coming forth in years ahead, especially for young people in terms of how they look at this. I'm not hearing.
I'm sorry. Do you want to go, Natasha, on that? Okay. I think that the decision of the announcements today by Biden very much, or actually fit what we have our sense about public opinion right now. And that is, if you look at the proposals that Biden has provided, what we've seen in the past day, they're basically not saying that people are not responsible. They're saying that if you are in a financial situation that you can't afford, the government will be forgiving for you for that period of time. And, that it makes, and the idea that people should not be so devastated by the increasing interest rates, that is a type of argument that the public could be very supportive of, because it's not saying people aren't responsible, but people shouldn't be, but people should not be responsible in situations that they didn't have much control over, in situations in which just the interest rates are just too high. Now, I think for most Americans, the idea that you owe, let's say, $20,000 when you leave college, and yet because of the changing of interest rates in your financial situation, you now owe $60,000 from that initial $20,000, would come off as inherently unfair to most Americans. So those types of views, I think, those type of changes, I think, are changes that are very easy, should be changes that people will be very, very supportive of.
Yeah, the theme of fairness is something that came up a lot. And so both in terms of the price of higher education, but also in terms of the way that debts should be structured and handled, that Americans overwhelmingly believe in the promise of higher education, but they're very passionate about the fact that it should come at a fair price and under fair terms for people.
Thank you. Well, I have a few questions from our audience. The first one is from Nick Gebbia. He's one of our doctoral students in the Gardner Fellowship Program. His question is, how do age differences change from 2010 to 15? I wonder if the overall 2010 to 15 shift is more because one new 18 to 29 group leans even more government, or to all groups changing their opinion?
Sure. There's whenever there's change, and there's a change regarding age, you really need to know, is this sort of like some type of cohort replacement factor going on, or is there change in public views? But the one thing we should note is the change from 2010 to 2015 was so dramatic that a change in the composition of the population cannot explain that. And we find that people of all age groups have changed their attitudes. So the answer is to all groups changing their opinions.
Yeah, we do expect, though. I mean, you're right, and this is a great question, Nick. So this is probably the first question that we usually get from most reporters is like, what is changing, and like what specifically is happening with age groups? And it is that everyone is changing, but we do expect that future generations of college students and those who consider higher education pathways are going to continue to be more liberal too, especially as policies have changed.
Thank you. Another one of our David Gardner fellows, Irina Chekray from UC Davis, asks, are you able to observe differences in terms of who should pay by immigrant background?
Yeah, this is a great question too, and we would love to have this information, but we don't have immigration status in the data set. I think it's something that we could potentially put on in future iterations, but especially in the 2010 and 2015 data sets, when we were doing telephone interviews, we're having like pretty intimate exchanges with people over the phone, and then to just ask them, so what's your immigration status, is probably not something that would be met with wouldn't go super smoothly. But that's something that we could definitely think about incorporating in the future, especially for people who are immigrating or grew up in contexts where higher education was either free or really inexpensive, like in a lot of European countries and elsewhere, to come from a situation where higher education isn't extremely expensive, and then to come to the US where we have this completely different situation, is something that some of our respondents mentioned. And we think that that's something that, especially if you're very familiar with that context, would be really salient for people.
Thank you. Another question by our visiting scholar, Takuya Kimura. The data by race was very interesting. I'm interested to see how this issue can be discussed in terms of first generation issues. Any thoughts there?
So this is, I assume this is those who are the first generation in their family to go to college. So how do their views about the funding of college align or not align with the rest of the population? And that would be kind of a complex thing to figure out, especially because you could think about how, for example, the parents of first generation students, how they think about the funding of college versus the students themselves. Again, not something that we have data on necessarily, but I think we would expect this to be a population where there's a lot of support for government investment in higher education, not only because this is a group that's making a lot of effort and a lot of financial and time investment in attending college, but also because they're aligning with a lot of the other demographic characteristics that we do have in the data set that says that those folks are really supportive of government investment.
Yeah, and as the question notes, it links very much to the pattern regarding race. And if you look at the racial groups we have, the racial groups would have a disproportionate number of first generation students, or have children who would be first generation in terms of education. They are the ones most likely to say there should be parents in government or have some type of governmental support, and the least likely to say should be the student.
Thank you. We have another question from, I think, Professor Stevens out at Stanford, giving you kudos, great work. And then like to ask you to speculate on why Americans have this sense that responsibility for paying for college is plural, divided among multiple parties rather than singular.
And is the second part right below it in contrast to K through 12? Is that part of his question too, I think?
Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Okay. Do you want to? Okay. Why would speculate? Why? Well, first thing is the reason we know that it's plural here is we asked the question. We said who should be most responsible, who should be second most responsible, and admittedly, when we think about K through 12 public education, people think about it in terms. They do think about the funding of college should be is a public good. So what I can say is that quite a few people we interviewed precisely said the same general point that Mitchell's saying. Why should support for kindergarten through 12th grade be a governmental goal, a responsibility, but then afterwards it shifts? Several people, in fact, said that having a college degree today is tantamount to having a high school degree from years ago. And if that's the case, the government should be involved. So so for a large number of people, that's it. At the same time, though, there still is this American individualized mentality regarding college. It's still very clear that there still is this individual component to it. But it's very clear also, though, that many people are beginning to see of college as just the natural extension of what we should be doing in terms of high school. And quite a few people also mentioned, college tuition is free in many other countries around the world, and use that as a reason why the government should be involved, should be the primary responsibility.
I think your question is interesting also, Mitchell, because that's a fair point. Like we make people say who should be the first and second most responsibility. And so we don't ask them should there be a second? But I think part of that comes from the understanding that the cost of higher education is too large for any one person or group to be responsible for it alone. That may not be the case for government, for example, like the government can conceivably pay for the entire thing. But for people to say students by themselves is a little bit unrealistic. So, I think in the future, it's a good thing to ask, I was going to say, how should we spread this, but across multiple stakeholders, but that's a little bit too complex for the average survey or interview. But knowing how people think about the locus of responsibility and the extent to which it should be spread among multiple stakeholders, maybe more than two, maybe, many more than two, is something that I think is really interesting and that your question gets at.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you about your findings related to geographical difference of opinion. Northeast maybe looking more to the federal government, and the West Coast maybe looking more to the state government. When I was leading the CSU, we were pushing the federal government hard for increases in Pell Grants, and I'd love to ask you to talk about how that fits into the data that you've collected. But then, states like California making a huge investment in their public higher education, while other states making, a lower level of investment and maybe counting on a larger federal investment. How should elected officials think about this, given the data from your study?
That's a great question. And I don't know, Brian and I have never actually talked about this. So, so I may be saying something that you disagree with, Brian, but I think this is this is like the place in the data where, this is where the knowledge of the public gets tested a little bit, I think. So when I said at the beginning of the presentation that the general public doesn't know about a lot of the specifics regarding the funding of higher education and all of these like specific policies, I think the same is probably true about the extent to which the federal government or the state and local government contribute to higher education and what parts of it they're responsible for. So in that sense, it's more in terms of like who they trust, who they see as responsible for higher education, more than like, when there's an appropriations bill, there should be like this amount that's coming from this source and from this source. But in that sense, though, like the pattern that Brian mentioned about the Northeasterners being much more familiar with the federal government and Californians and West Coasters being much more familiar with the state and local governments is just a reflection of like where they see the goods of higher education coming from. Brian didn't mention this part, but people specifically mentioned being from California. And that was a real point of pride for me. So they would say, I'm from California. There are excellent options at the community college level, at the trade level, at the bachelor's level, that and that makes me like trust my state and the opportunities that are available from the state or local government. So I don't know, Brian.
Actually, we don't disagree. We don't disagree.
Okay. I don't know.
I also think, and again, it really is this question of, when we're asking people questions about issues regarding higher education, it's sort of like, it really is sort of this overall gestalt view regarding education. The specific knowledge, like some things we're really surprised by, like when you ask people how much money do you think, we've tried, there've been several different types of questions that I've done or we've done or other people with me have done, where we give them vignettes, we give them information about a person. They say the person has a college degree, does not have a college degree. How much money do you think this person's going to make 1 year from graduating? How much money do you think they're going to make 10 years from graduating? And then we ask the same question in which they don't have a college degree. What's going to be like 1 year, 10 years from? And people are surprisingly, on the average, is surprisingly close in terms of at least the people's perception of the ratio of how much, what you make with a college degree versus what you would make with a high school degree. So on one level, there's some pretty general good knowledge on stuff, but on other things like how things are actually funded, that's not the case. Just anecdotally, I was talking to a group and I had mentioned that, because the state of Indiana takes great pride in its education, higher education system. But the one thing that's happened since I arrived is the percentage of support that universities rely on the state keeps on plummeting and plummeting and plummeting. And I gave this talk, and there were people who seem to be people should know about Indiana. They're very invested members of the community. Had no clue that is changing. So it's a really tricky thing. On one hand, we are saying we should be paying attention to public opinion. On the other hand, we're also saying that on certain dimensions, public opinion, it's not public opinion, but public knowledge is limited.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then the goal is just to figure out on what issues the public can be really instructive about, and then using their insights for those questions. Yeah.
Thank you. I know we're getting close to the end of our time with you. One of the questions that came in before our event was talking about corporate influence. And I just wanted to ask if you have any thoughts about the role of private philanthropy in terms of being responsible in some way to help cover the cost of higher education or not.
Go ahead.
No, you can go first.
I was going to say that's tricky. There are all kinds of public philanthropies that stand for different, areas of society and different causes. On one hand, any mechanism that reduces costs for parents and students is, something that is a step forward, but at this, it's a tricky balancing act, I would say. I don't think it's something I don't think that's the type of item that would necessarily play well in a public sample, because I think people have really limited knowledge of how that really adds to the higher education landscape. But for us as practitioners, this is something that is becoming much more important.
And to add to it, it also would, I can also imagine the response. I think, as Natasha said, the response, I think a lot of people would struggle with that question. I think they also might struggle with it. They say, well, who's contributing? Like, which type of, and we keep on hearing about these, different groups of people, who, come from very different type of political perspectives. And that may also complicate people's reactions to it. It complicates the way many of us within higher education look at it.
Well, thank you both very much, Natasha and Brian. We really appreciate that you shared your research findings with us and have this great book that we can all read to get more detail. And I want to thank our audience for joining us today for this very important talk on a subject that's timely in so many different respects, and wish everybody a safe day. I know it's raining throughout California. Be safe out there.